Good evening, all, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the pleasure of serving as director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. I also want to thank the Public Programs Division of CUNY and Karen Sander for sponsoring this event and encouraging you all to attend in person, finally. We're getting back to in-person events. Please note that our next event will take place on Wednesday, May 8th at 6:30 p.m. with the celebrated author Paul Hendrickson. I will be talking with Paul about his memoir of his father, Fighting the Night. This in-person event will take place in the Skylight Room on the 9th floor, but it will also be live streamed. But tonight I am delighted to introduce Natalie Dykstra, the author of the highly praised biography, Chasing Beauty, The Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner. Natalie will be in conversation with Rachel Cohen. Natalie is the author of Clover Adams, A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life. Her work on Isabella Stewart Gardner has won a public scholars grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the inaugural Robert and Ina Caro Research Travel Fellowship sponsored by Biographers International Organization. Dykstra is an emerita professor of English at Hope College in Michigan and lives with her husband in Waltham, Massachusetts. Rachel Cohen is the author of 3 books of nonfiction, Austin Years, a memoir and 5 novels, Bernard Berenson, A Life in the Picture Trade, and A Chance Meeting, which is being reissued for its 20th anniversary by the New York Review of Books Classics. Cohen's essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, The Believer, and The New York Times. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacDowell Colony, and the New York Foundation for the Arts, and is professor of practice in the arts in the creative writing program at the University of Chicago. Please look for all these books at bookshop.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. But tonight, both of these authors have books for sale in the lobby. Natalie and Rachel will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from our live audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our events. I just want to add one more sort of program note. Next May 2nd, we are also sponsoring a program here at CUNY, a biography of Ella Fitzgerald. And, look on the website to find more details about that, but that's also a great event. Anyway, on that note, Rachel, you now have the floor.
Can everyone hear me? Oh, it's nice. It's got a reverberant sound. It is such a pleasure to be here this evening and to celebrate your wonderful biography. Natalie, I'm so thrilled. Chasing Beauty is just an extraordinary book. So many congratulations.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for being here with me for this conversation and for all of you who came tonight.
Yes, it's just great to be here. So I think we thought the first thing you might do is read a little bit of it just so we can get the sound of it in our ears. And would you like to go ahead and do that?
Yes, let me start with, I'm going to start at the beginning, which hopefully sets the table for our conversation. And I have a few slides, not too many, but a few. So, notes on a museum. At the turn of the 20th century, a large palace rose on the edge of Boston's Fenway, marshland that would soon become part of a series of city parks called the Emerald Necklace. The plain facade of the 4-story gray brick building was skirted on its east side by a high wall. Few people had seen beyond the building's spare wooden doors. When the palace, known then as Fenway Court, opened as a museum in 1903, a surprise awaited the first visitors. The pink stucco walls, resembling the exterior walls of palaces lining Venice's Grand Canal and pierced with balconies and arched windows, enclosed a stunning courtyard garden. High above, a glass roof let light pour in. Paintings, tapestries, prints, porcelain, rare books, manuscripts, and fine furniture filled 3 stories of the surrounding spacious galleries. Classical marble figures stood tall in the courtyard among palm trees and delphinium, and at its center was a 2nd century Roman mosaic floor fabricated during Hadrian's rule, featuring a snake-wreathed head of Medusa. Rubens and Holbein portraits, 3 Rembrandts, and a small, let's see if I can get it, and a small Vermeer hung on green silk-covered walls. Nearby galleries displayed Italian Renaissance paintings by Raphael and Botticelli, Fra Angelico and Titian. Intricate Chinese embroidery, animal figures made of jade, and a large Japanese screen could be found in another. Painted and stamped leather panels covered the walls of one room, decorated with large 18th century Venetian mirrors, 10 walnut armchairs, an exhibit of precious old lace, and 4 small pastels by James McNeill Whistler. Visitors were then, as today, drawn in by the expanse and revelation of the courtyard and galleries, by the way one moves from outside to inside, as if experiencing the light and shadow of a Venetian day. No single artwork appears in isolation, but rather in assemblages or tableaux of historical and cultural and personal import. Anne Hawley, the museum's emerita director, rightly calls Isabella Stewart Gardner an installation artist because of the way she put artwork and other objects together in unexpected combinations. Francine Prose has written that to step into the museum is to enter Isabella land. Here, one of the most important art collections in America is displayed in a singular and dramatic way. A question posed in a popular journal near the time the museum opened is still relevant all these years later. What manner of woman is she who has built this unique temple of art? In her own time and now, Isabella Stewart Gardner seems like a bright sun. We can look around her but not directly at her. She radiates but confuses. A relative remembered how she filled the air. Another thought her charisma was like dynamite. She carried herself with noted sureness, with a gliding walk, like a proud ship in full sail. Young people particularly liked to be with her because, as one said, she annihilated the thought and possibility of failure. She had had many advantages. The eldest daughter of a wealthy New York family, she was educated at a Paris finishing school, followed by an early and envied marriage into the prominent Gardner family of Boston. But all this did not protect her from the terrible pain of losing her only child. A friend noted her tendency to be self-protective, remarking that she rarely expressed her feelings directly. Yet she had a reputation for being an attention-seeking busybody, with money enough to boss most everyone around. Isabella surely relished having all eyes on her. Early on, she carefully collected reports of her toings and froings in society, knowing that mentions in the newspapers need not be positive to be good. She was often portrayed as imperious and eccentric. But this stereotype recast her intense drive, her fearlessness, and her entrepreneurial skills as something far less potent and disruptive, easier to mock and set aside. She had a method to her work, which she explained in an undated letter, quote, "I am obliged to correct my steps, that is, to do only certain things and not to add outside ones. I have a great deal of constant and necessary work to do that I can accomplish only in that way." No one, except maybe her husband, Jack Gardner, would have suspected she could accomplish all she did. Isabella was a late bloomer, a woman who saw what was expected of her as a Boston matron and decided to be something else. She made sense of her long life through far-reaching travel, avid collecting, and an all-consuming pursuit of beauty, which came to form the through line of her story. The record she left to the world is her Wunderkammer, her world of things. There is a journey one makes at Fenway Court, from the exuberant celebration of earthly life on the first floor, with the Farnese sarcophagus in the blooming courtyard, up the staircase to galleries that display the enormous power of queens and kings and popes, to the Titian Room, its walls covered with luxurious red textiles, named after the painting by the Italian master that was one of Isabella's greatest prizes. From this triumphant moment, a turn into the long gallery, with its Bardini blue walls, presents images of ultimate sacrifice and pain. Botticelli's Madonna cradling the boy she knows one day will die. Giovanni della Robbia's lamentation over the dead Christ, sorrow sealed in Mary's face, and a final turn to the glorious colors of the medieval French stained glass window at the end of a narrow corridor in the small chapel. This is what mattered to her. As one ascends the steps of the museum, one is immersed in splendors of temporal power, but then a turn is made near the end to the spiritual, to everything that can never be contained in a museum. Thank you so much.
It's a wonderful piece of writing that brings us immediately into the museum and into the life of this very unusual person. And so I appreciate so much you sort of helping us to begin in that way. I've read that opening many times, and it makes you want to go on the journey. So it's really, that was wonderful to hear it in your voice. This is such a difficult biography to write, and I feel like if you're inside the work of doing biography, then you recognize certain things about the challenges of this that yes. I just kind of want to ask you about. That, a biographer sometimes has a tremendous record of letters and materials that they're working from, and Isabella Stewart Gardner destroyed a lot of letters and
bonfires. Yes,
she really, she lit them on fire. She shredded them. So there are huge missing documentations. And then on the other side, there's a sort of superabundance of, there's this huge museum with all these artifacts and all this collection. So you have sort of way too much and way too little in this. And so I wonder kind of if you could just tell us a little bit about how, like the sort of process by which you felt like you kind of uncovered clues, like where you found moments where you're like, oh, I think I'm onto something here. I'm starting to see how to manage this unwieldy,
Yes, unwieldy was exactly the right description of it. I kept diaries. I kept journals, notes that I would take early in the process. And I have one a little bit later that said, what's my task? To tell the truest story I can. And then I sort of say, don't get lost. Because, of course, I did get lost, of course. Yeah. And it reminds me of Henry Adams' saying about biography when he was struggling with his biography. You're confronted with either too little evidence or too much. And she definitely had both at the same time. And so I was really, early on I knew, and because I also had the opportunity, I wanted to write it in time with her. I wanted to grow with her in some way and sort of so the early part of her life was really a lacuna. I think I have a phrase in the book, it was like she was Athena rising from Zeus's head. Somehow she appeared in Boston, and of course she did have this New York family and history, and so I really started there. And early, I think even before I sold the book, in fact, I know it's in my proposal for the book, I did some research at Grace Church here in New York at 10th and Broadway, and that was her family's church. And I started to see her father, David Stewart, and her mother, and there was marriage records and birth records, and then once you have that record, suddenly they become these real people in your imaginations. And then I went to a service there, and toward the back of the church, there's an extraordinary window by Henry Holliday, and it's the Stewart family window, because Gardner's was the oldest of 4, and all her siblings died by 1883, and her parents were still living, and they put up in their memory, this extraordinary stained glass window. Yeah. And I thought, there's a connection between that window and what her parents had done on a small scale, and her response to Jackie's death, her child's death, in sort of this pursuit of beauty. So then that opens up the early part of her life. Yeah. And even though there's not as many direct documents, you start to be able to piece together what their family must have been like, and where she went to school, and who her classmates were, and then you look at friendship albums. Friendship albums are always good. Sometimes you spend hours transcribing, and you think, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And then you come across a name, and that name then leads you. So it feels sometimes like there's clues. Clues.
Yeah, you're a detective in that way. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that in the book. It's very moving the way that window, that stained glass window, is joined to these different art, like stained glass that appears later, but also other kinds of art settings. And it's just something I admire so much about your work, that you're so able to really take the visual world and make it give us knowledge about people. I just think that's such a hard thing to do, and you do it beautifully in the Clover Adams book too, where you take those photographic records and you just let us see into Clover's mind by the photographs she took and the way she arranged them in those albums. And here it was just on a massive scale, because it's this gigantic building with thousands of works of art in it, and somehow you're trying to read it. But I remember that her travel albums were also something that helped you start to feel like, I see how to put this figure together and understand her.
I mean, her eyes saved her, right? So her child died in 1865, and her doctor told her she could have no more children. She's 25. She lives on Beacon Street. I got census records for what families lived on Beacon Street, because I wanted to imagine all the kids running up and down those streets, and playing in the public garden and the common. And I thought, what would that be like? What was she going to do at 26?
Yeah.
Right? And that world that door had closed. And then she goes on it, and she's depressed. She's very, very sad about that, right? It's very, very hard. And then they have a travel cure. Her doctor tells Jack, she needs to see if travel will help. Yep. And so then they go on that first tour in Europe, and you can see in that very first travel album, first of all, you can see how precise she is. I just love her precision. It scared me out of my mind, too, right? Right. Because, of course, you want to be precise, too. And, right?
Your subject, yes.
She's scary. And so, but she was so precise. I've seen a lot of 19th century women's albums because of my work on Clover Adams and her photograph albums, and some of them are kind of hodgepodge, but Gardner, it's like she's hanging paintings on the wall. Every margin is perfect. I actually measured the margins of her travel album to see if they were as perfect, and sure enough, she did. She measured them, So she's just so visual, and that really was such a clue, right? It was really her capacity to respond, and through her eye saved her in a certain way. I started to see it, but those are first things, you take copious notes and you sort of think, okay, yeah, that's going to help me, to know that about the albums. And it just was so helpful. This was before the pandemic, so I was working with an extraordinary archivist, the head archivist at the museum, and she would she would say, do you want to see this album? Mm-hmm, yes. Would you like to see her newspaper clipping albums? Yes, absolutely. Let's see those. So that was very, very helpful to see the material that she actually had her hands on. Somehow that's so vivid to me.
Yeah.
It's a spark, or it's a...
Yeah, to touch the thing.
Yes,
that
yes.
person
You know, to
touched.
see what ink she has, or you see the stationery. I was at Itati to see her letters to Berenson. Now, those are published, but to see her script,
Yes.
right? You've seen those same letters, I
Yes,
think. And they're-
I went to read them too.
Yes.
We have some biographies in common. We have like a lot of.
That's right.
Because I wrote a biography of Bernard Berenson, who helped build the
Yes.
collection
Yes.
that Gardner built, and so that correspondence is one of the remaining correspondences that
Yes.
those letters, he kept them all, and
Yes.
so they are a good source in both directions.
Yes, and the printed, of course, it was hugely helpful, but just to see her pen across the page, you know how big her script got?
She wrote huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
And when the
Just-
Titian
and
arrives, you know, Titian is this high on
Yes.
her. The Titian has arrived. Yeah.
Yes. Exclamation marks. you
Yes,
know, it's here.
exclamation marks. That's
It's
right.
here, it's
That's
here.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's so vivid. That's somebody's personality you can get close to.
Yes, yeah. I remember a moment where I was looking at Berenson's responses to different dealers, and dealers would send him paintings and say, you know, we want you to authenticate this, and then
Yes.
sometimes he would have to say, it's not what you think it is. And one of my favorite was this huge letters, not Veronese, like exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. That was it. That was the whole letter. Yeah, one thing that I think all that fine attention to detail that you bring, the care of like measuring the margins and going through all the books and stuff, is that you start, because women who do extraordinary things and get sort of forgotten or derided for the thing that they've done, you often, like, it goes missing what their particular skills were, how they, like, none of that really gets documented in quite the same way, so that you don't, like, that's a great curatorial skill. And if it was a man who was a curator or a collector, they would say, like, they had a perfect geometric eye, they could measure, you know, in this way.
Yeah.
And it would be sort of recorded as this great talent, but it's not in the record. So, but then you have to, like, measure the margin, and then you're like, oh, I see.
Yes.
She had
She's
that
practicing
kind of
in her albums.
crazy geometric
Yeah.
spatial eye that
Yeah.
a great curator and architect
Yeah.
has.
Yeah. It mattered to her.
Yeah.
It mattered.
Yeah.
It was important to take the time to get that exact,
Yes.
to use the right glue,
Yeah.
so that the paper doesn't cockle, right? So a lot of the women's albums of that time period, they're kind of wavy, and not hers.
Yes. Right.
Right?
Because she's,
Flat as a
'cause she's
pancake.
like making installations, small ones
She's
first,
making
and
the
then-
installations, and it's pleasing her eye.
Yeah.
You can tell there's something pleasing to her, and that drive, right?
Yeah.
There's ambition even in those albums.
Yeah.
Private albums. It
Yeah.
mattered to her.
Yeah, and then that serves you so well when you get to the big project of the
Yes.
museum, because there is a sort of fashion for being like, oh, it's too much fabric, and I can't see the paintings, and it's ugly, it's not my style, I don't want to go there anymore.
Yeah.
But that kind of fails to take the measure of the specific creative project that she was
Yes.
engaged in and what
Yeah.
she was doing. Yeah, and I do think in your book you feel so much her as collector, as architect, as, you know, it's a multi-talented
It's a vision.
thing
It's a three-dimensional vision. So she sort of practices in this two-dimensional space of these albums, and then she adds a dimension to it, right?
And it gets just
And
as
so
big
now
as
you're
her
entering
handwriting.
in,
Yeah.
right? And now you can enter in.
Yeah, and I love that in the part you read, that sort of the way that you get pulled in and the way that she's using light and shadow to kind of bring
Yes.
you in. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she's taking all those travels, like her time in Venice, you know, those extraordinary, the deep shadows, and then that bright Italian sun, and there's an aspect of that at the museum, right? And she's aware of that. She's very, very aware of that.
Yeah.
She's very aware of how light is in the room. So there's the Raphael room has these so many rooms have extraordinary textiles, but it particularly is in the Titian and the Raphael rooms. It's red textiles, and some of it is shiny satin that makes that light bounce, and some of it is a deep velvet that closes the light,
Yeah.
captures the light, and she knows she's pacing your eye around the room, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's just,
it's
it still
really
sort of takes my breath away in some ways.
Yeah.
What she accomplished with that.
Yeah, yeah. It makes me think, another thing I want to ask you about is you have a wonderful cast of secondary characters in this.
Yes.
Berenson has his cameos. He had a somewhat dubious role. And, but also I particularly love John Singer Sargent in this
Yes.
book. He's so alive, and and I do feel this shared sensibility between them, that they cared about
Yes.
fabric, and they cared about light, and they cared about
Yes.
spaces, and
Yes.
it's nice and that he was working there in her museum at the end
Yes.
of her life, that he had that kind of residency there. And
Yes, I mean,
So-
it was always a good day when John Singer Sargent was my, when he sort of strolls. You have these characters that kind of come into a chapter.
Yeah.
I always looked forward to that,
Yes.
those days when he was there.
The Sargent days.
Yeah, because the thing I want to say something about Sargent, and it just always stays with me, he was such a generous man. He was just a generous person, and so he was good company. And I loved reading his letters, and I was very moved by their long friendship, right? Especially toward the end of her life. And I can read the end of the prologue, but we can come back, we can swing back around to Sargent. But yeah, he understood. They did have an understanding of, and he understood her character. I think that's why those portraits of her are so durable, enduring.
Yeah, that's right. Because then that's another kind of visual evidence that you're making wonderful use of, where you are having not only like the people like Henry James writing about her, writing novels in which like she's kind of a character. So there's sort of, you have this wonderful literary observation, but you also have this incredible visual observation, like to have Sargent portraits of your person that has a depth that you can study. Like you can sit in front of that painting and you can think, who is that person and what did Sargent think of her? And
Yes, and how the iconic portrait of her, which I think I can show next. Let me just put it up there while we're talking about it. That's the 1888, and was painted the same year as this photograph that you've been looking at this whole time, also 1888, and she's holding her hands in a similar way. And what I love about this is he captures something dynamic about her, even though she's very, very still in the portrait, right? And the way he uses those extraordinary pearls, I think also the way that, he captures, I don't know if I'm saying that quite right, if she's both still in there, it's not like the Zorn on the cover of the book, where she's in motion, and yet because of the pattern of the fabric and the looping of those pearls, there's still movement. And movement was so key to her character.
Yeah, she was always in motion.
Always
She was
in motion.
Always traveling. She was always doing a next thing.
Yes.
She was,
Yes.
And she was making a space that you would move through, and
Yes.
there was a circulatory quality
Yes.
about everything around her.
Yes. She tired everyone out,
Totally. They were like,
including
"Enough
her
already,
biographer.
Isabella."
Yes, exactly.
Berenson would be like, oh my God, we had this exhausting day. I cannot tell you how many things we had to do. And he was the one who usually tired his friends out. But but she overmatched him.
Henry Adams has this great letter to someone else saying, I heard of Mrs. Gardner's travels, just hearing about it tires me out. So, but
exactly.
I feel like that's just the equipoise of that portrait is so compelling to me. And her, sort of the beauty of her, the shapes are so wonderful.
Yeah, I really see it anew, kind of with this book and through your eyes, although many things in the museum were very familiar to me for a long time, even I had written about them, but there's a way that as a whole, you've just managed to really give it its own, like this is a sort of a double portrait of a woman and a museum, you know? And it really, it's very beautiful in that way.
It was, thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying that. It was, in some way, she had been overshadowed by her accomplishment, right? Her accomplishment ended up sort of putting her away from us for a while. And so the question was, how could I both have her come to the center, absolutely to the center, but also have the museum there?
Yeah.
right?
And sort of take both things seriously and rebalance the
Yes.
understanding.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, there's so many things I want to ask you about, but another thing that interests me is, I mean, I think in writing history, there's a tendency to want to bring people, to make them make sense to us, you know, like to say, like,
Yes.
let's here are the things that we can easily sympathize with or understand. And one thing that I admire so much in the way you think about history is that you do let people have their differences, their remoteness. Like sometimes you'll say in conversations we've had, like, they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have thought that. That wouldn't be the way it would. And I think that also allows it to have its reality and its kind of clarity. And I thought about, for me, one such key was in kind of looking at Berenson's life. I realized that, like, art had a lot of both sensuality and spirituality.
Yes.
Like, it really, like, if you had in any way a queer sensibility or a sort of libertine sensibility or a non-traditional kind of feeling, like art was sort of the place you went. And they all read Walter Pater, who nobody reads anymore. But so I went and I read Walter Pater, and I was like, oh, I see. It's like kind of sex and religion, like in art, you know. That's
bodies.
Yes, all that
should be able to see.
Place for those things. And I do feel, I mean, both sensuality and spirituality really significant for her, but different in that period than for us.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a soft cloud of things you might say something about. Yeah.
I mean, there's many ways to go with this. You know, I guess, you know, how do I want to say this? I don't want to ever blame the past for not knowing what we know now or how we think now, right? And so how do we, someone asked me, I guess I'll come at it from a different angle. Someone asked me, would you be friends with Mrs. Gardner? And I said, absolutely not, right? It seems such a, because in one way, how do I want to say this? It's too cozy. You know, that's not my relationship to her. Because she's a 19th century person and I'm a 21st century person. And so I kind of needed to have some formality there. If that, does that help?
Yep.
And so, and not deference, and not, it wasn't, but it was, I didn't want to, I needed that formality between my century and hers.
Yeah.
That there was a difference, and I needed to respect that difference. Otherwise, the reader wasn't going to feel the difference.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're more than just in different clothes, right? They have a different idea of self, and they don't use that language. They had an idea of soul, and they would be sad, and they did use the word depressed, right? But their understanding of self is pre-Freud. They don't use the language that we use. And so and this is really Jean Strauss and Alice James, where she stayed so close to the 19th century language for Alice James, and that always so impressed me, because that also helps the reader get to that time in their imagination. Yeah.
To sort of not take the shortcut of pretending it's the same thing.
Yes, to not take the shortcut of pretending it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. I really like this historical novel by George Eliot called Romola, which nobody reads, but it's really strange. It's about Botticelli, and so I read it because it's also Renaissance art when I was doing that book. And it does capture the weird distance, like they don't seem like us, you know, those characters. And I think that's a sort of an interesting idea of historical fiction and of historical writing, that it might feel quite far. But we have
and yet you can accompany them.
Yes, you really can. You really can. You can. And sometimes I feel that they're quite calling out to be heard. You know, that there's like and you think like, I think I'm catching the echo, you know, I think I'm getting it.
And do you feel this responsibility? Like, I've felt such an incredible responsibility to her, because so many fictions had been made of her in her own life, in her own time, and I just felt, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I remember in a slightly personal interlude,
Yes,
because
yes.
we started
Yes.
talking about this project a long time ago. A long time ago. And it was daunting. I mean, it was
Yes.
very daunting to take on this big life. And it
Yes.
did seem also like just so much noise of all these other interpretations, and kind of how do
Yes.
you clear that away and get to your own view. And I mean, I was shocked when I did the research for the Berenson book that there was no good Isabella Stewart Gardner biography.
Yes.
I thought, surely this is such a wonderful subject, somebody must have done this. But there
Yes.
are real problems with all the previous ones. You're very generous with them, and there are strengths to all those books also. But this was really kind of crying out to be written, I think.
Yes, and I think it's in part because of the shape of her life. So there's this, she has this tragedy, and then there's really a long quiet. Mm-hmm. Right? And it takes a long time for her to find her voice. I don't want to use that, that's our language, that's not hers. But find her way, a path, a future. And I think that put people, sort of, because what do you fill that with?
Yes.
And you don't want the reader to entirely know that. Right? And so it was understanding how to have those chapters talk about other things in her world, whether it was Boston or her friendships or her the travels, of course, and the Jack Gardner and his family, and suddenly that part of her life started to fill up more, right? Mm-hmm. And then you hit the sort of the collecting, and I think that then suddenly there's so overwhelming
then you have the opposite problem.
amounts of material, reams of material, and just files and files and files of dealer files at the museum, and which paintings to cast. And why aren't you writing about this painting instead of that painting, right? So all those decisions that you have to make. So I think that was an unusual shape.
Yeah.
And yet I think I was very moved by someone who came into her own. The museum, she was 63 when the museum opened, which was the average lifespan in America at the time. So she has this late bloom.
Yeah.
And that was very moving. And she lives long enough to know what she's accomplished. So she lives to 84, when she's 84. And that I also felt, right?
Yeah.
Because so often when women accomplish great things, they die or they drown or they, right? They get punished in some way,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
In fiction or...
operas.
Yes, yes, that's right. And so I that also was, I was very, and I thought, would it be possible to capture something of that shape?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's well put. It is a shape. And I remember you,
Yes.
and I remember that you were like
Yes.
equal parts hope and despair. Yes. You were like kind of like, is this going to be okay? It's not going to be okay. It is going to be okay. It's like, yeah.
Yes, and Rachel would say on the other end of the phone that I was gripping very tightly, Natalie, I think that's good. I think you should keep going. I think that sounds like a good way to think about it. And yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah, well, it worked. It really worked. It really worked. But I think that it's something that I teach my students when I teach your work, as I teach from Clover Adams, and I will teach from this book, and it's valuable in all kinds of nonfiction, because there's always things that you don't know. I mean, there's always things you can't find out. There's what you think the world is an endless record, but no, there's so many absences
Gaps.
and missing things. And
things.
You are not going to find it all. And I think of it almost as like having two skis. Sometimes I say this, like that, and I just think you're so good at it, like the friendship books, or like filling in, using something else to fill in when there's no immediate record, so that it's like the kids running on the street, or the other things that you work to envision, so that then it's like we lose this ski of our central character for a little while, but we can still go with the story because we're getting the world,
Yes.
and so we're getting other girls who are like her, or people who are growing up, or other people who are traveling to Europe at that time, or the different ways of kind of holding us with the story. And you're just so inventive about that, and the students find it very helpful to kind of think about it in your work.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of descriptions of her houses right? Because first of all, she hired this extraordinary photographer, and you saw some of his work, but she also hired him earlier. So suddenly I could be in her boudoir, I could see, and then I have a wonderful description of Thomas, the playwright, Thomas Russell Sullivan, who describes being in that room. And then I have a scene of Henry James visiting her there, and she served him tea and Russian tea cakes, and I had a newspaper report that said she loved to wrap up pine boughs, and she didn't like the smell of coal, so she had fireplaces in all her rooms, and she would throw them on the fire. So then when Henry James comes for tea, it smells of pine in her. And then suddenly you have a scene from not very much, it's in my endnotes, but it's, suddenly you can envision that. And then he has this wonderful line. Oh, I love that line. He said, "I love the sound of your conversation." What a compliment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then suddenly you can get the excitement. And he's reading to her from his draft of Daisy Miller of the play.
Yeah.
And how thrilled she must have been to be his audience in that way.
Yeah.
So those are. So then
Those
suddenly
things
it's
become vivid, and then
suddenly
then
there's a lived life there, and you can picture Boston, and you look at a lot of weather reports. There's a lot of reports of, is it sunny, is it cloudy, is it cold, is it right? Because you want that
atmosphere,
because you get the atmosphere. As much as you can.
Yeah.
So
I think we have time for me to ask you one more question, and then we should have audience questions.
Did you want me to read from the last 3 paragraphs of the prologue? I don't have to, but...
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Should we do that?
Yeah.
And we can look at one more Sargent?
Yeah,
Is that okay for
sounds
the
good.
audience?
Let's do that.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, so let's see if I can get that turned. All right, this is the great last one. This is 3 paragraphs, I promise. On September 14, 1922, an especially warm day, the painter John Singer Sargent paid a visit to Fenway Court, where Isabella Stewart Gardner, now 82 years old, lived on the 4th floor, as she had since her museum's opening almost 20 years earlier. He knew the palace well. The two had been friends since Henry James introduced them in 1886. 2 years after that, Sargent's large oil portrait of her, with its ropes of pearls and show of milky arms, scandalized Boston's elite Brahmin society, much to her delight. She invited the painter to live and work for a month at her museum after its opening, which he did, using the 3rd floor Gothic room as his studio. She collected a number of his works, including the theatrical El Jaleo with its life-size dancer in mid-step, seemingly ready to sweep across the entire south wall of the 1st floor Spanish cloister. Now Sargent asked to paint his friend's portrait again. He did so quickly in the span of a morning's visit. A debilitating stroke in 1919 had paralyzed Isabella's right side. Though she managed to dress every day and was able to sit upright, her life had been much changed. She used the elevator she had installed decades before to travel from her 4th floor apartment to spend time with her magnificent art collection on the lower floors of the palace. She liked to sit in her office, the McKnight Room, on the 1st floor, surrounded by artwork made by her contemporaries, men and women both, with her books and travel mementos near at hand. Here she received visitors and welcomed Sargent, who brought along his paints. Sargent's composition, entitled Mrs. Gardner in White, is a harmony of color and patterns suggested in light washes of color. Isabella is seated on a sofa against red striped pillows, swathed head to foot in shroud-like white fabric that frames her face and hides her crippled hand and right side. The painter's genius for depicting draped fabric is on full display. The watercolor painting has both clarity and mystery, to borrow Combe-Toibin's precise phrase for what characterizes Sargent's best portraits. Sargent also catches a quality of Isabella's observable since childhood, a powerful force of feeling. If her body and limbs are still, her eyes hum and buzz with life. She has seen much, searing loss, but also accomplishment and great beauty. Margaret Chandler, a friend, thought it a wonderful sketch of her in this last stage, pale and frail and dominating to the end, and noted how, quote, her green eyes had lost none of their bright malice. seeing, appreciating, appraising. Sargent pictures Isabella in the here and now, even as her garment references what is to come. But he also renders something of a surprise. In his masterpiece of old age and impending death, he does not forget youth, her youth. A woman's bright lip and cascade of dark curly hair is just visible in the shadow on the pillow behind the sitter's left shoulder. The image in the shadow is as mistakable as it is provocative. It is as if Sargent is saying that even the ravages of age cannot dim the vitality of who Isabella once was, who she still is. This, then, is her story.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah.
What a treat, what a treat.
It's a pleasure to have the image with us as we hear that.
Yes.
So we want to open it up to all of you for questions. We can't see you that well in
No,
this
we
light,
can't.
but we know
Now
you're
I can.
there.
Now I can.
Sir, in the front there.
I know some stories about Isabella Stewart Gardner, and I wonder if they're apocryphal. She was said to have had a pet ocelot, and she would scandalize her lost neighbors by walking it on a leash. And she was
No, that one's not true.
No, that's not true.
also said to have her chauffeur drive her from Fenway Court down to the Church of the Advent, where during Lent she would scrub the steps.
Yes. That is true, but it didn't happen every single Lent. But that one did happen. Yes, that is true. Yes. Yes, yes.
And what happened to the ocelot?
No ocelot.
No
But there
ocelot.
were lion cubs, right?
There were lion cubs,
Lion
but whether
cubs.
whether they were in the carriage or, the newspapers, there were conflicting reports in the newspapers.
There are a lot of stories. The newspapers loved it.
But she hired a newspaper clipping service because she loved to see herself.
That's
Yeah.
a good detail, too.
Yeah.
Oh, Mike's great. Thank you.
Yes.
Did you get to know her to the point of feeling how she felt when some of her paintings were stolen, cut out of their frames?
That's a good question. I think I speculate a little at the end of the book that she would have been furious. She just would have been heartsick about it. And there's a story of one of her paintings that when it got shipped overseas, somehow a piece of wood went through the portrait, right? And she's outraged to Berenson. I'm blanking on what, and they had to get it, I think it was a Moroni portrait, and they had to get it repaired. And she was, of course she was, let me back up. So when the painting would arrive, I love these scenes, she would unbox them. She would be completely thrilled when she got the Velázquez portrait of King Philip IV, and it arrived. She says to Berenson, His Majesty has arrived, right? I mean, they were like people. She referred to them as him and her, right, depending on who was in the portrait.
Who was in it, yeah.
Yeah, and so she would invite people for tea, and she'd put, if there was a smaller portrait, she'd put them on a chair so that they could, Rembrandt's self-portrait was on a chair, and she had people over for tea, so they could commune with the great art, right? So she personified those paintings. So of course I think she would have been completely heartsick. I also think she would have been so proud of the museum for surviving it. That could have gone very differently. That was an incredibly painful time in its history. I'm also it's their history to tell, right? It's after my book or after her life. So I think she would have been very, very proud that they had kept to her vision after such a disaster. That's a good question. I mean, I will also say Rembrandt wasn't her favorite painter either. So they missed the Titian. Yeah. They missed the Titian. And the Botticelli.
True.
And the Botticellis.
And that Titian was at the
yes,
center
everyone loved
for her.
Rembrandt. She was she knew she needed to collect him, but she wasn't, yeah.
It wasn't, yeah.
Since this event is being broadcast over the internet and recorded, we strongly encourage you to use the microphones that are located at the end of each aisle. Thanks.
Hi. I spent the first 35 years of my life in Boston, and the Gardner Museum was one of my sacred places.
Yes.
One of the things that's so magical about it to me was that it never changed, that you would go in,
Yes.
and there was a cycle of plants that would be put in different places that were always, you would repeat every year, you'd see them. And I just wondered what you think she would have thought about the changes that have gone on in the museum in the last 12 years when they built the big addition. I would imagine she would have been probably very proud that would happen, but at the same time, there's something, to me, it was like a violation in some ways, even though I had already left Boston and I only came back and saw the museum a few times as a visitor at that point. It was very hard for me to see this place that was so sort of magic and never changing, and then to see it go through so many changes. I wonder if you could just speak. Oh, and then
Yeah,
one
that's
more
a really
thing.
good question, and I to speak for her about something that's happened, I guess I think she would have been very glad that the building was preserved, and there was just really no way to preserve the original Fenway Court without that addition, because curators they had offices and closets, and there was just no space for a modern museum. They really, Ann Hawley, who was director at the time, is very eloquent about the building of that, making those decisions. So it was a long process in the board and with museum directors and the community that it really, something had to be done. And she was a businesswoman, and she would have understood that, I think. And they did it as sensitively as they could, but you are right that you enter into the museum in a different way, so you don't have quite that moment of dark Boston, snowy, cold, and then that overwhelming sense of that courtyard when you come in, as you used to come in to the museum. But I think there were all these other contingencies that
wonder if
were
the theft-
also important.
Did the theft play a part in the fact that they felt like they needed to modernize?
No, I don't think that was connected, and there is this wonderful Daring by Design that the museum put out about the new edition that will give you a much from the museum's point of view. So it's a good question.
And just one more quick thing. One of the things I used to love at that museum was that there were all these like secret things, and she had in some of the long hallways were these cases covered with black fabric of
gallery cases
of letters.
Yes.
And I found it so ironic to hear that she had destroyed so many of her own letters, but here she collected. Do you write about those letters at all?
Yes, of course. Of course, she was really her own archivist. And that's an insight by Casey Riley, who's a wonderful curator, was a guest curator at the museum, and she wrote a beautiful article about this, that Gardner really understood that she needed to document the who and what and how of this place. And so she loved lists. I told the archivist at the museum, I want to see all her lists, and she said, there's a lot of them. There's really a lot of them. And, there's lists of galleries and of those gallery cases, too. So she was very aware of those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Good
And maybe
evening.
we might even take a couple questions, and then you might answer, just so we get a couple more of
Yes.
them. Yeah.
What was the most difficult side or part of her for you to capture, and how did you capture it?
What was the most difficult
Okay,
part?
think about that, and we're going to get the next question,
Yes.
too. And then maybe one question will answer the other one.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would be.
Go ahead.
What I find really compelling about Isabella is her ability to connect with so many, I think, for the time, like outsiders, like Bernard being Jewish, Sargent being gay,
Yes.
and all of these other, composers that
Yes.
weren't getting work and this and that. So my question is just for you as, why do you think that is, and what made her able to connect with all of these different artists and people that were kind of on the outside?
She was an outsider herself. She knew what that was like, to be set aside, pushed out, And she was very good at assembling families for herself. And so there's this wonderful group called the Dabbsville Group up in Gloucester, and most of them are gay. And they have her for Thanksgiving, and she goes out for the summers, and she loves being with them. A. Pied Andrew in particular, he was kind of the ringleader of the group. And it's in part, they're talking about art and travel and politics, and they're not talking about kids and grandkids, and right. So there's a way I think that she felt she understood something about their lives, and I think also, yeah, that's a longer answer, but the one I gave is pretty much, yeah.
I would add also to the people that you said, and that Okakura is somebody who really comes through beautifully in your story, and that was the other question that I wanted to ask you, is that it's a very global book, and you really recognize, like, Japanese art was very important to her. She had a really wide view of what art could be, and that figure of Okakura is another person who really comes in beautifully. But I don't want you to ignore that gentleman's question. What was the hardest thing for you to capture?
It's the combination of that extraordinary vitality, right? That intensity and vitality, and then there was something also very spiritual, right? And I didn't want that spiritual side to get too sweet, right? That there was a rigor in it.
Yep.
And how to convey that rigor of her spiritual life, I think that was a challenge, right? And that combination, and then she had a front side of her personality and a backstage, like we all do, but she had a particularly intense version of that, and to understand that dynamic in the book, I think, and to keep track of in my own writing when I'm writing about that front stage and when I'm writing about the backstage of her life, if that makes sense. Yeah, does it?
Does.
Okay.
Let's take this last question, please.
I also grew up in the Boston area, like the other woman, and we would always combine our visits to the Gardner Museum with the Museum of Fine Arts.
Yes.
Okay, right. What was Isabella's relationship with the museum?
Complicated. Complicated. I mean, she was friends with a lot of the curators, the young curators there. One of my favorites is Matthew Stewart Pritchard. Akakura was a curator at the MFA, but they had a big debate about how to see art, and the MFA went one direction and she went the other, right? So she wanted to have paintings in situ, right? So you're seeing a painting like you would in a palace, and the MFA was, made choices like the Met, right? Where you're seeing a painting in isolation. And so there was tension back and forth, and William Sturgis Bigelow was her friend, and then wasn't her friend, and then was her friend, and it was complicated.
Yeah.
There's a good book being written right now by an art historian about the building of both those museums and the relationship between. Yeah, it's a couple years out, but he's a very good scholar, and it's a part of the story that needs to be told.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for
being here.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
Means the world. Means the world. Thank you so much
pleasure.
for having me. Thank you very much. And for this.
And we want to say thank you to Shelby White and Leon Levy Foundation for making this series possible. And we thank you all for coming this evening and sharing this conversation.
Thank
and
you.
we will be signing books, so come and talk to us.
Yes, come talk to us. Thank you so much.